At 18, Mara Ellison had everything she owned stuffed into 2 duffel bags, an aging pickup that barely started, and a dog named Scout sleeping in the passenger seat. The foster family who had promised she could stay until she found her footing had changed their minds the morning after her 18th birthday. By sunset, Mara had no family to call, no permanent address, and barely enough money to keep gas in the truck. Then she saw something almost nobody else wanted, a remote Wyoming homestead being sold by the county for just $200. The cabin was falling apart, the road was barely passable, and there was one problem that made everyone else stay away. The property had no water. When Mara placed the only bid, a rancher in the back laughed and said she'd just paid $200 for 40 acres of thirst. Maybe he was right. But Mara bought it anyway, because after spending most of her childhood moving from one foster home to another, even a broken cabin without water sounded better than another place where someone could tell her to leave. For the first few days, she hauled drinking water from town, patched holes in the roof, and tried to convince herself she hadn't made the worst decision of her life. Then Scout began acting strangely. Every evening, the dog disappeared behind the cabin and returned to the same abandoned stone well, scratching furiously at the hard Wyoming dirt beside it. Mara pulled him away once, then twice. On the 3rd evening, Scout refused to stop. His paws tore through the dry soil until something underneath made a sharp metallic sound. Mara grabbed a shovel and started digging. A few inches down, she uncovered the rusted corner of something that had clearly been buried there by hand. She kept digging until an old metal box emerged beside the sealed well. There was no lock, only layers of rust and a strip of faded lettering across the lid. Mara wiped away the dirt with her sleeve and froze. One word was still readable. Ellison. Her own last name. Mara had never been to this homestead before. As far as she knew, nobody in her family had either. And when she finally forced the lid open and saw what someone had hidden inside, she began to understand that she might not have found this land by accident at all. But before we go back to the morning Mara was told to pack her bags, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Wherever you're listening from, whether you're starting your morning, taking a quiet afternoon break, or listening late at night, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people uncovering forgotten family secrets and finding hope where nobody expected it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the day Mara Ellison turned 18 and discovered just how quickly a place she thought was home could stop being hers. The morning after Mara Ellison turned 18, Diane Vickers stood at the kitchen counter with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug and told her she had to leave. Mara thought she had misunderstood. 3 weeks earlier, Diane had said she could stay until she found work and saved enough money for a room. Paul had nodded from the table and told her not to worry about rushing, but now Paul stood by the refrigerator without looking at her. And Diane kept talking about expenses, space, and how 18 meant adulthood. "We've done what we can," she said. "You need to start figuring things out for yourself." Mara stared at the cereal going soft in her bowl. "You said I had time." Diane's expression tightened. "Things changed. That was all." Mara had heard versions of those words before. Different houses, different adults, same meaning. Pack what belongs to you, don't make this harder. She swallowed whatever answer had risen into her throat and went upstairs. Everything she owned fit into 2 duffel bags, a backpack, and a cardboard box of things she had never found a reason to throw away. She packed quickly because she had learned years ago that moving slowly made departures feel worse. Scout watched from the doorway, ears lowered. The mixed-breed dog had been the one constant she had chosen for herself, and when Mara carried the first bag outside, he followed without being called. Her pickup sat at the curb with fading blue paint and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. Paul came out once and handed her an envelope containing the rest of the cash they had been holding for her. "There's a little over $400 in there," he said. Mara took it. "Thanks." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but he only nodded. Diane did not come outside. By 9 in the morning, Mara was driving away from the house where she had spent the last 14 months pretending she might finally be allowed to stay. She did not cry. Crying made it harder to see the road. She stopped at a gas station, counted her money twice, and bought the smallest amount of fuel she thought she could get away with. She also bought a bottle of water and a packet of crackers. Scout got half the crackers. Mara spent the day filling out online applications from the parking lot of a public library using free Wi-Fi until the building closed. No employer called. By dark, she had nowhere to go. She parked behind a 24-hour grocery store beneath a broken light, leaned the seat back, and put her jacket under her head. Scout curled across the passenger side, his body pressed against her hip. At 1:17 a.m., someone knocked hard on the glass. Mara jerked awake. A security guard stood outside with a flashlight. "Can't sleep here. I'm leaving," she said immediately. The truck hesitated twice before starting. She drove until she found a roadside pullout several miles beyond town and spent the rest of the night there, listening to wind move across the open country. In the morning, her neck ached and her phone battery was nearly dead. Scout sat up when she did, tail tapping once against the seat. Mara looked at him and forced a smile. "Great first day of adulthood." She drove back toward town, stopping at a county building because a notice board outside advertised temporary work, equipment auctions, and tax disposal properties. Mara barely glanced at the property listings. Land belonged to people with savings accounts, lawyers, and trucks that started on the first try. Then one sheet caught her attention. Remote homestead, county disposal, 40 acres, existing cabin, minimum bid $200. Mara read the number 3 times. The photographs explained it. The cabin leaned slightly to one side. The roof looked patched in at least 4 places. The dirt road was described as seasonal access. Electrical service was uncertain. Near the bottom, under utilities, one sentence had been typed in capital letters. Old well, non-producing, no verified potable water source. Mara almost laughed. $200 for a house where a person could not even turn on a faucet. She started to walk away, then stopped. $200 would not buy a month's rent anywhere she had looked. It would barely cover a deposit. Here, somehow, it could buy land. She went inside and asked the clerk if the listing was real. "Real enough," the woman said. "You should read every line before bidding." Mara did. The more she read, the worse it sounded. She asked whether anyone else had placed a bid. "Not yet." "What happens if nobody does? It stays on the list?" Mara looked through the window at her pickup. Scout's nose was pressed against the glass. She thought about the security guard tapping on her window. She thought about Diane saying things changed. A ruined cabin without water was still a place no foster parent owned. "How do I bid?" she asked, an hour later. Mara sat through the small county sale in a room with folding chairs and 7 other people, most of them older men interested in equipment lots and grazing parcels. When the homestead number was called, nobody moved. Mara raised her hand. 200? A man 2 rows behind her gave a short laugh. Nobody countered. The clerk waited, called for another bid, then closed the sale. As Mara stood to sign the paperwork, the man behind her shook his hand. Kid just bought herself 40 acres of thirst. Heat climbed into Mara's face, but she said nothing. She paid the $200. The receipt left her feeling terrified and strangely lighter at the same time. Outside, she sat behind the wheel and stared at the document until the word owner stopped looking imaginary. Her name was printed beside it, Mara Ellison. "Guess we have somewhere to go," she whispered. Scout wagged his tail. The drive took nearly 2 hours, the last stretch over a rough road that rattled the truck hard enough to make Mara grip the wheel with both hands. By the time the homestead appeared, evening light was turning the Wyoming grass copper. The cabin looked worse in person. One shutter hung loose. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. The porch steps had split down the middle. Mara parked and got out slowly. There was no sound except wind and the ticking engine. "Home," she said, testing the word. Scout jumped down and raced ahead. Mara carried one duffel bag to the porch, then heard him barking behind the cabin. Not playful barking, sharp, insistent bursts. "Scout!" She followed the sound around the weathered wall. He stood beside a circular stone structure half swallowed by weeds, front paws braced against its cracked rim. The old well. Scout barked again, staring down into the darkness, then lowered his nose to the hard ground beside the stones and began scratching furiously at the dirt. Scout kept digging until Mara caught him by the collar. "Enough!" He resisted, paws scraping at the dirt beside the old well, then finally let her pull him away. Mara found a warped sheet of plywood near the shed and dragged it over the cracked opening. Whatever had interested Scout could wait. Darkness was coming, and she had a house to inspect before deciding whether it was safer than sleeping in the truck. The answer was barely. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, dry wood, and mice. The main room held an iron stove, a scarred table, and cabinets hanging crooked against one wall. One window was broken. A dark stain spread across the ceiling beneath a section of damaged roof. Mara tested the floorboards before putting her weight on them. They creaked, but held. The bedroom contained an old metal bed frame and nothing else. "Luxury," she told Scout. He sneezed into a cloud of dust. She laughed, despite herself. It was the first time she had laughed since leaving the vicar's house. Mara carried both duffel bags inside, but did not unpack them. Instead, she set them together beside the door, exactly where she could grab them quickly. Habit. She found an old hand pump behind the cabin and worked its handle. It groaned. Nothing came out. She pumped harder until her shoulder hurt. Still nothing. The county listing had warned her, but reading "no verified potable water source" on paper was different from standing beneath a huge Wyoming sky with less than one bottle left. Mara poured some into Scout's bowl, drank 2 careful mouthfuls herself, and stopped. Tomorrow she would need more. That night she slept in her jacket on the bedroom floor with Scout against her back. Wind found gaps around the window frame. Twice she woke thinking she had heard someone outside, only to realize it was a loose shutter striking the wall. Morning revealed more problems. Mouse droppings covered one pantry shelf. A corner of the roof showed daylight. The kitchen faucet produced a cough of air when Mara turned it. She wrote a list on the back of the county paperwork. Water, roof, window, food, gas. The first word took priority over everything. She drove into the nearest town with Scout beside her and found a hardware and feed store near the main road. Inside, she loaded several gallon jugs of water into a cart, then stood comparing prices on roofing patches. A young man in a work shirt was stacking bags of feed nearby. He looked at the water in her cart. "Camping. Something like that." Mara chose the cheapest patching compound. The man glanced at it. If that's for a roof, you'll need flashing tape too. That stuff won't hold by itself. Mara checked the price. Then it'll have to learn. He smiled slightly. Bad roof, bad everything. She pushed the cart toward the register. I bought a place outside town, where Mara hesitated, then described the road and the turnoff. His expression changed. The Ellison place. She stopped. What did you call it? Ellison place. Why? Old properties get called by family names around here. He seemed surprised by her reaction. That's what I've heard people call it. Mara stared at him. My name is Ellison. Now he looked genuinely confused. You related to whoever had it, but I don't know who had it. A silence opened between them. Mara disliked the feeling immediately. She had spent years answering questions about family with some version of, I don't know. Who are you? She asked. Eli Mercer. He gestured toward the name stitched on his shirt as if proving it. I work here, and I don't know anything useful about whoever owned that place. Just the name. Right. Mara looked back at the shelves. Eli apparently understood that she did not want more questions. He pulled down a smaller roll of flashing tape. This one's cheaper. If you're only patching around a leak, it should be enough. Mara checked the price and put it in her cart. Thanks. You have water out there? No. Eli glanced at the jugs again. That'll get expensive, fast. I noticed there's an old well, isn't there? Doesn't work. Then don't trust anything from it even if you get it moving. Not until it's tested. Mara nodded. It was practical advice, not pity, and she appreciated that. At the register, she watched the total climb with every jug and repair item. Water, tape, patching compound, canned food, dog food. Money that had seemed thin yesterday now felt dangerously finite. She removed 2 items she could live without and paid. Eli helped carry the water outside. You doing all this alone? He asked. Mara opened the truck bed. I've got Scout. Scout raised his head through the open passenger window. Eli looked at the dog. Then I guess you're covered. Mara almost smiled. Back at the homestead, she spent the afternoon covering the broken window and making the smallest roof repair she could manage. The work was clumsy, but when she finished, the loose edge no longer lifted in the wind. She lined the water jugs beneath the kitchen counter and calculated how many days they might last. Not enough. Scout disappeared while she was counting. Mara found him beside the old well again, digging at the same patch of ground. Scout! He ignored her. She pulled him away and placed a heavy piece of timber over the spot. An hour later, he was back, nose pressed to the earth beside the timber. What is wrong with you? Mara moved him again. By evening, her hands were sore and dust covered her clothes. She ate canned soup warmed on the iron stove and gave Scout his food. For several minutes, the cabin felt almost normal. Then Scout's ears lifted. He ran for the door. No! Mara followed him outside. He raced directly to the well. This time, before she reached him, he had pushed around the timber and started tearing at the hard soil with both front paws. Dirt flew behind him. Scout, stop! A sharp sound cut through the scratching, metal against claw. Scout froze. Mara did too. She crouched beside him and brushed loose dirt away. Beneath the soil was a straight rust-colored edge. Not rock, not pipe. She went to the cabin for a shovel. The ground was packed hard, and whatever lay underneath was larger than the corner Scout had uncovered. Mara worked carefully around it, widening the hole until the outline of a shallow metal box emerged. Someone had buried it beside the well. Her exhaustion vanished. She knelt and scraped dirt from the lid with her fingers. Rust had eaten through most of its surface, but beneath the grime, she saw faint marks. Letters. Mara rubbed them with the sleeve of her jacket. The first disappeared under corrosion. The next became clearer. She wiped again, then stopped breathing. Across the old metal, barely visible but unmistakable, was a single word: Ellison. Mara remained kneeling beside the hole until Scout pushed his nose against her arm. Ellison! She rubbed the lid again, half expecting the letters to become something else beneath the dirt. They did not. Her surname had been stamped into a metal box buried beside a well on land she had bought only days after being told she no longer had a home. "That doesn't make any sense," she whispered. Scout sniffed the box and sneezed. Mara worked the shovel beneath one edge and levered it upward. The box was heavier than it looked. She dragged it free, carried it into the cabin, and set it on the scarred table. Rust had fused parts of the lid. She used a screwdriver from the truck, working carefully until the seal broke with a brittle crack. For one ridiculous second, Mara imagined money. Cash would fix the roof, buy water, maybe repair the truck. Instead, she found old paper. Of course. Scout rested his chin on her knee. The contents had been wrapped in yellowed oilcloth, which had protected them surprisingly well. Mara unfolded it carefully. Inside were several documents: a thin notebook, faded receipts, a hand-drawn map, and a black and white photograph. She picked up the photograph first. A man and woman stood in front of a cabin. Mara looked past their faces to the building behind them. Same porch, same window placement, same slope of roof. It was her cabin, decades younger. On the back, written in blue ink, were the words Thomas and Evelyn Ellison, 1978. Mara read them twice. She knew neither name. The documents beneath the photograph contained legal language she barely understood: parcel descriptions, acreage, signatures. The name Thomas Ellison appeared repeatedly. The notebook was filled with measurements and short entries in cramped handwriting. Some referred to fence posts, repairs, feed, and weather. Others contained numbers followed by the word water. One abbreviation appeared over and over: N.S. Mara opened the hand-drawn map. A rectangle marked house sat near a circle labeled Old Well. A dotted line began behind the house, crossed the property, then continued toward higher ground. Beside it, someone had written N.S. line. Mara stared at the map, then at the dark kitchen faucet. If these papers belonged to another Ellison, she needed to know why. By morning, curiosity had overcome her reluctance to spend fuel. She selected the photograph, map, and several documents, returned the rest to the oilcloth, and drove into town. The county building was quiet. The clerk at the front desk listened to Mara's explanation and directed her to a records room where an older woman with silver hair was sorting folders into a cart. Nora Bell, the woman introduced herself. Retired county clerk. Apparently retirement means coming back twice a week because nobody else knows where anything is. Mara placed the photograph on the desk. "Do you know these people?" Nora adjusted her glasses. Her expression changed almost immediately. Thomas Ellison. Mara felt a small tightening in her chest. "You're sure? I haven't seen this photograph. But yes, that's Thomas." Nora tapped the image lightly. "And that should be Evelyn." Mara unfolded the map. "I found these buried on the property. Buried beside the old well." Nora looked from the map to Mara. "What property?" Mara gave her the parcel number and described the homestead. Nora leaned back. The old Ellison homestead. Hearing Eli say it had been strange. Hearing Nora say it felt different. Why does everyone know that except me? I don't imagine everyone does anymore. Nora studied her. What's your name? Mara Ellison. Nora's eyes sharpened. Ellison? Yes. Are you related to Thomas? I was hoping you could tell me. Mara immediately regretted how defensive it sounded. Nora did not react. What do you know about your family? My mother was Rachel Ellison. She died when I was little. I went into foster care. I don't know anything useful beyond that. Nora's face softened, and Mara disliked that more than defensiveness. I don't need sympathy. I wasn't offering sympathy, Nora said. I was thinking about where to start. That answer disarmed her. Nora moved to an old computer terminal and searched the parcel index. She found Thomas Ellison's name quickly. He had owned the homestead decades earlier. Evelyn appeared on one entry as well. After that, the record became harder to follow. Nora opened scanned pages, cross-referenced numbers, then went to a cabinet for older indexes. There are transfers referenced here that aren't complete in this file, she said. Missing? Not necessarily. Misfiled? Never digitized. Attached to another record? Old county paperwork can be messy. So Thomas owned it. Yes, that much is clear. Mara touched the photograph. And then that part is less clear. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the first answer she had. Someone named Ellison had lived in her cabin. Someone named Ellison had buried records beside her well. Nora examined the hand-drawn map next. What's in S? Mara asked. I don't know. It's everywhere in the notebook. Nora traced the dotted line with one finger. Interesting. What? Your well is here. She pointed to the circle near the house. But this line doesn't terminate at the well. Mara leaned closer. The line ran away from it, across the upper edge of the property and toward the hills. Maybe it's not a water line. Maybe. Nora turned the map over. But there was nothing on the back, though whoever drew it wrote water beside two measurements. Mara remembered the dry hand pump and the gallons she was hauling from town. Then where does it go? Nora shook her head. Higher ground, apparently. One question had been answered only to create several more. Mara gathered the papers, but Nora held the photograph for another moment. May I see your ID? Mara stiffened. Why, please? Mara reluctantly handed over her driver's license. Nora placed it beside the photograph. Her gaze moved between Mara's face and Thomas Ellison's. Mara could see no obvious resemblance beyond dark hair, and the old photograph was too faded for much detail. What are you doing? Nora did not answer immediately. Instead, she returned to the computer and searched another index, this time using names rather than the parcel number. Thomas Ellison, Evelyn Ellison, Rachel Ellison. Mara watched Nora's expression change. What did you find? Nora looked at the photograph again, then at Mara. You said your mother's name was Rachel Ellison? Yes. And you never knew her parents? No. Nora removed her glasses. Mara, I don't want to tell you something this important until every record is checked. Tell me what. Nora hesitated. Only a second. I think Thomas Ellison may have been your grandfather. Mara drove back to the homestead with Nora's words repeating in her head. Thomas Ellison may have been your grandfather. She did not believe it. More accurately, she refused to believe it yet. Believing would mean accepting that while she had moved through foster homes, carrying everything she owned in bags, there had been 40 acres in Wyoming where people with her name had once lived. She parked beside the cabin and found Scout waiting at the window. Apparently we have relatives, she told him as she opened the door. Scout wagged his tail. Don't get excited. They're dead. That evening, Mara spread the photograph, notebook, and map across the table. She studied Thomas and Evelyn until their faces blurred. She wanted to recognize something, her mother's eyes, her own mouth. Anything but the photograph offered no certainty. The next morning, Nora called. She had found old newspaper archives and additional property references and wanted Mara to come in. Mara almost said no. Instead, she drove to town, calculating fuel costs the entire way. Nora had printed an old notice mentioning Thomas Ellison and the Homestead. "It confirms he was here," she said, "but I'm still working through the family records. If he was my grandfather, why didn't anybody come looking for me?" Nora paused. "Records can tell us names and dates. They don't always tell us why people made choices." Mara hated the answer because it was reasonable. She folded her arms. "I had a family name nobody bothered to explain to me." "Then we explain what we can prove," Nora said. One piece at a time. Mara left with copies and stopped at the hardware store. Eli was unloading fencing supplies. "Any luck with the roof?" he asked. "It's still above me." "That's usually the goal." Mara hesitated, then showed him the map. "You know the area better than I do. Can you tell where this line goes?" Eli studied it. "Maybe. Hard to judge from an old drawing. Nora Bell says Thomas Ellison owned the place." Eli looked up. "And she thinks he might have been my grandfather." He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask how she felt. He simply looked at the map again and said, "That makes finding out where this goes more important." Mara appreciated him for that. Eli finished his shift several hours later and followed her to the homestead in his own truck. Scout greeted him as though they were old friends. "Traitor," Mara muttered. They started near the well. According to the map, the dotted line crossed behind the cabin before angling toward higher ground. Eli used a narrow metal probe to test the soil, while Mara compared landmarks with the drawing. After nearly an hour, they found nothing. The sun was high, and Mara had already emptied most of one water bottle. "This is the stupid part," she said. "What, searching for water while trying not to drink the water I had to buy?" Eli handed her his bottle. "I'm fine. I didn't ask." She almost refused, then drank. They continued uphill, near a collapsed section of fence. Eli's probe struck something solid. They dug carefully until Mara's shovel scraped metal. A narrow length of corroded pipe appeared beneath the dirt. Mara crouched beside it. "So the map is real." "Looks that way." Eli exposed another foot. The pipe continued uphill, exactly as the dotted line indicated. Mara looked back toward the cabin. Then the well wasn't supplying this. Not if this line carried water downhill, from where Eli pointed toward the rising land beyond the property. That's the question. The discovery should have felt like progress. Instead, Mara saw another problem. The line crossed the fence and continued onto land that was not included in her parcel. They followed only as far as the boundary. Before Mara could decide what to do, an engine approached along a ranch track beyond the fence. A pickup stopped nearby. The man who climbed out was broad-shouldered, sunburned, and looked to be in his early 50s. "You the girl who bought the Ellison place?" "Mara Ellison?" His eyes rested on her for a moment. "Wade Harlan. My land starts at that fence." Mara glanced at the exposed pipe. "Do you know where this goes?" "I know you're digging close to my property. I'm still on mine, and I'd like it to stay that way." His tone was firm rather than threatening. Eli stepped nearer but said nothing. Mara held up the map. "This pipe used to serve my homestead. It crosses your land." Wade's expression tightened at the word, "my." "That line hasn't served that house in a long time." "So you know about it?" "I know there was an old spring line." Mara felt suspicion rise immediately. "Are you using it?" Wade looked toward the hills.
Our ranch uses spring water, has for years, water that used to come to this property. Those aren't the same question. They sound pretty similar, Wade exhaled. Your family leaving doesn't make me a thief. The word family struck harder than the accusation.
You knew them? My father knew Thomas better than I did. What happened? Wade looked at the cabin in the distance. More than one thing. That doesn't answer me, no. But I'm not discussing 40 years of property history standing over a fence. He pointed toward the boundary. Don't dig beyond there without permission. He returned to his truck. Mara watched him drive away. You think he's hiding something? She asked. Eli considered it. I think he doesn't like being accused of stealing. Mara looked at him. You think I was wrong? I think we found a pipe. That's what we know. The answer irritated her, mostly because it sounded like Nora. One piece at a time. Back at the cabin, Mara washed dirt from her hands using as little bottled water as possible. The pipe had answered one question the old well had not been, the homestead's primary source. But now the line disappeared onto Harlan land, and Wade clearly knew something about it. Late that afternoon, Nora called again. Can you come in before I leave? Mara heard something in her voice and drove back despite the fuel. Nora was waiting with a photocopy of an old obituary. Evelyn Ellison, she said. I found it in an archived newspaper. Mara read the names. Thomas was listed as Evelyn's husband. Then came the surviving family, one daughter, Rachel Ellison. Mara stopped. Her fingers tightened around the page. That was my mother. I know. There could be another Rachel. Nora slid a second record beside it, containing a matching date and identifying information. Mara stared until denial became impossible. Thomas Ellison had not merely shared her surname. Evelyn had not been a stranger in an old photograph. Rachel Ellison, the woman who had once held Mara as a child, whose face Mara remembered mostly through a few photographs, was their daughter. Mara looked down at the obituary again. The cabin, the buried box, the name stamped across its lid. The land she had bought because nobody else wanted it, all of it rearranged itself around one fact she could no longer dismiss. She had not bought a stranger's abandoned homestead. She was standing on the history of her own family. For the next 2 days, Mara found herself angry at people who were no longer alive. Thomas, Evelyn, even Rachel. Especially Rachel. She understood that her mother had died when Mara was young, understood that whatever choices had been made before foster care were probably more complicated than a county file could explain. But the knowledge did not make the questions smaller. If this land had belonged to her family, why had she never heard of it? If Thomas had been her grandfather, why had there been no photograph on a shelf, no story, no address written on the back of an envelope? Mara had spent years assuming there was nowhere to return to because nowhere had ever been offered. Now she woke each morning inside a cabin that had once belonged to people with her name. It did not feel comforting yet. It felt like evidence that something had been withheld. Practical problems refused to wait for emotional answers. Her water supply was disappearing faster than she expected. Scout drank more in the heat than she had calculated, and every repair left her covered in dust that she could not afford to wash away properly. She rationed water for cooking, drinking, and the dog. Everything else became optional. By the third morning, she stood at the kitchen counter looking at 4 remaining gallon jugs and did the math twice. Buying water every few days meant fuel. Fuel meant money. Money meant fewer repairs. The homestead might belong to her family history, but history did not fill a glass. Mara drove into town and found Eli in the hardware store. I need something cheap that can catch rain, she said without greeting. Eli looked toward the bright sky outside. Optimistic. I didn't say frequent rain. He showed her plastic sheeting, a used barrel with a lid, and a length of guttering someone had returned. Mara bought only what she could justify. Eli helped her load it. "You still following that pipe?" he asked. "As far as I can without Wade Harlan accusing me of invading Wyoming." "He didn't accuse you of that. He was thinking it." Eli smiled. "You want help setting this up?" Mara hesitated. She had learned to treat offers as debts waiting to be collected later. "Why?" "Because if you do it wrong, half the water will run into the dirt." "That's not really an answer." Elle rested one arm on the truck bed. "Because I'm off in an hour, and you need water." Mara looked at him, searching for the hidden condition. There wasn't one she could see. "Fine." Back at the homestead, they attached the old guttering along the least damaged section of roof and directed it into the barrel. The setup looked uneven, but Eli tested the angle with a bottle of water, and most of it flowed where it should. "Temporary," he said. "Everything here is temporary." Mara immediately regretted saying it. Eli glanced at the 2 duffel bags still sitting beside the door, untouched since she arrived. "You planning to leave?" "I didn't say that." No, he did not push. That made her want to explain, which annoyed her more. Instead, she picked up the notebook and map. "I want to check the line again." They returned to the section of corroded pipe they had exposed near the fence. Mara had spent the previous evening comparing measurements in Thomas's notebook with distances on the property. Several entries referred to repairs at intervals along the water line. One measurement seemed to place something below ground before the boundary. They walked slowly, counting paces. Scout ranged ahead, nose down in the grass. "Here," Mara said. They dug in a patch of harder soil and found nothing. 10 feet farther? Eli's shovel struck stone. Another few feet revealed an old metal fitting half buried beside the pipe. Together they cleared the dirt away. It was a valve assembly, corroded but intact enough to recognize. Mara brushed the surface with her glove. 2 sets of initials had been scratched into the metal. E, H, and T. "E. Thomas Ellison," she said. "Probably." Eli pointed to the other initials. "E, H could be Evelyn." Mara nodded. The sight of their initials bothered her more than the photograph had. Photographs belonged to archives. Initials scratched into metal belonged to people who had stood here with tools in their hands. They built this, at least worked on it. Mara followed the pipe with her eyes toward the boundary. Then whatever supplied it had to be uphill, unless the line was pumped. Thomas wrote gravity numbers in the notebook. Eli looked at her. "You've been reading it closely." "There isn't much else to do after dark." They were covering the valve again when a pickup appeared beyond the fence. Wade Harlan stopped on the other side and got out. "You two planning to dig all the way to Montana, still on my property?" Mara said, "I can see that." Wade looked at the exposed valve. His expression changed slightly. "Haven't seen that in years." Mara straightened. "So you know what it is?" "Old cutoff valve, for the spring line." Wade nodded once. "Then the spring is on your land?" "Yes." "And my family used it?" "Yes." Mara folded her arms. "That would have been useful to know yesterday." "You were busy accusing me of taking it." Eli stepped back, letting them handle it. Mara felt heat rise in her face, but did not apologize. "What happened to the line?" Wade looked toward the hills. "It stopped serving this place after the Ellisons left." "Why did they leave?" Wade was quiet for several seconds. "Your grandmother got sick. Thomas spent money trying to keep everything going. Ranching wasn't paying well. There were debts." Mara's anger shifted direction. "They lost the land?" "Not all at once. And your family got the water. My family already had access to the spring. Both properties used it." "Then why did you say my family leaving didn't make you a thief?" Wade's jaw tightened. Because I've heard that accusation before. Mara stared at him. From who? Doesn't matter. It matters to me. Maybe. But what happened back then wasn't someone sneaking over a hill and stealing a pipe. Thomas was in trouble. Your family left. The line to this house stopped being maintained. His voice softened slightly. That's the version I know. Did you know Thomas some? My father knew him better. Wade looked toward the old well behind the cabin. Thomas kept coming back after the house was empty. Mara's attention sharpened. Why? Never asked him. How often? Enough that people noticed. What did he do here? Wade nodded toward the cabin. Then the well. Mostly stayed around the house. Sometimes around that old well. Mara felt the buried box in her mind immediately. For how long? Years after the place was mostly abandoned. You're sure? I'm sure. Wade stepped back toward his truck. And before you ask, no, I don't know what he was doing. He left them with more questions than answers. Mara and Eli covered the exposed pipe before returning to the cabin. Inside, Scout collapsed near the door while Mara spread Thomas's notebook across the table again. She read through entries she had already seen, searching for anything that might connect Wade's memory to the well. Most pages contained measurements, weather notes, repairs, and expenses. She turned one page, then another. 2 sheets near the back felt thicker than the rest. Mara rubbed a thumb along the edge. They were stuck together. Eli. He came closer. What? These pages. Mara worked slowly, using the tip of a butter knife to separate them without tearing the paper. The top page released with a dry whisper. Hidden between them was a short entry she had not seen before. No date, no explanation, just one sentence in Thomas Ellison's handwriting. Mara read it once, then again. Eli leaned beside her. What does it say? Mara turned the notebook toward him. The faded words were still clear enough to read. Originals below stone. Copies aren't enough. Mara looked through the window toward the old well. The metal box Scout had uncovered was not the only thing Thomas had hidden. Mara was outside before Eli finished reading the sentence. Below stone, she said, looking toward the old well. That could mean anything. Eli followed her across the yard. Around here. That's a lot of stone. Scout raced ahead, as if he had been waiting for them to understand. The well sat behind the cabin, beneath the same warped plywood Mara had dragged over it her first evening. Around its circular base, weathered stones formed a low foundation, most gray with age and dust. Mara crouched beside the place where Scout had uncovered the first box. Thomas kept coming back here, she said. Wade remembered him around the well. The first box was buried here. If he wrote below stone, this is where we start. Eli nodded. They did not dig randomly. Mara brought Thomas's notebook and compared the measurements scattered through its final pages. One rough sketch showed the well as a circle with a small mark on its uphill side. The mark was so faint she had previously assumed it was a stain. Now she counted the stones around the foundation until she reached the approximate position. One stone was different. Not dramatically. It was flatter than the others and sat slightly deeper in the earth. Mara brushed away dirt from its edges. This one, Eli tested it with the shovel, could just have settled. Then we lose 20 minutes proving it. They worked around the stone carefully. It resisted at first, held by packed soil and decades of weather. Scout hovered so close that Mara finally ordered him back. When Eli levered the stone upward, a dark rectangular gap appeared underneath. Mara stopped digging. There's space! Together they lifted the stone aside. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with smaller rocks. Inside lay a narrow metal cylinder wrapped in deteriorating cloth. Mara reached for it, then hesitated.
The first box had felt strange. This felt intentional in a different way.
Thomas had written that copies were not enough. Whatever he had placed here, he had wanted protected. She lifted the cylinder out.
"Let's open it inside,"
Eli said.
"at the table."
Mara cleaned dirt from the cap. It had been sealed with wax around the threads. Eli used a utility knife to break the brittle seal, then handed it back to her.
"Your family?"
Mara twisted the cap. Inside were tightly rolled papers, protected by another layer of oilcloth. They smelled old, but were dry. Mara unrolled the first sheet beneath 2 cans to keep it flat. Across the top was a legal heading followed by names she recognized immediately. Thomas Ellison, Evelyn Ellison. "A deed?" she asked. "Looks like one." Eli did not touch it. "Nora needs to see all of this." The next document was a survey showing the homestead boundaries. Another sheet contained dense legal language surrounding the words access easement and water. Mara traced the lines slowly.
"I don't understand half of this."
"Neither do I." Useful team. Very. She almost smiled. Then she found a diagram attached to the easement. It resembled the hand-drawn map from the first box, but was more precise. A marked route ran from the homestead boundary uphill toward a labeled point beyond it. North Spring. Mara stared at the words. N.S. Eli leaned closer. North Spring. That's what Thomas kept writing. For days. The abbreviation had appeared throughout his notebook without explanation. Now the answer was sitting in front of her. The old well had not failed and destroyed the homestead's water supply because the well had never been the main supply. The family had brought water down from North Spring through the buried line. Mara looked toward the kitchen faucet.
"If this is an easement, does that mean I can use the spring?"
"It means you should ask Nora before telling Wade you own his water." "I wasn't going to say it like that." Eli raised an eyebrow. "Probably." Mara gathered the documents and drove to the county building with Eli following. Nora was still there. When Mara placed the cylinder on her desk, the older woman stared at it. "You found another one?" "Below a stone beside the well." Nora read Thomas's notebook entry, then put on gloves before examining the papers. Her excitement remained controlled. "These appear to be originals. Thomas said copies weren't enough. He may have had a reason to worry about what was recorded." Nora examined the easement. This granted access across adjoining land for a water line connected to North Spring. "So I have water rights." Nora immediately shook her head. "Slow down. You have an old document that appears to establish an easement. We need to verify whether it remained valid through later transfers, whether it was modified, and whether the property descriptions still correspond." Mara's brief surge of hope dropped. "So this might mean nothing." "I didn't say that. I said evidence and legal effect are not the same thing." Nora moved to the computer and began searching references printed on the documents. Some matched entries already in the county index. Others led to incomplete records. "The originals help," she said, "but they don't magically settle everything." Mara sat opposite her. "Nothing about this place does anything magically." Nora gave her a sympathetic smile. "Probably for the best." Nearly an hour passed as Nora compared dates and filing numbers. Mara watched the window darken and thought about the water jugs beneath her kitchen counter. North Spring existed. The old line existed. The easement had existed. Each answer seemed to come attached to another condition. Nora finally pulled one page from the stack. "This is interesting." It was correspondence rather than a deed. Thomas had written it during a dispute over a later transfer. Several paragraphs were too faded to read easily, but one sentence remained clear. Rachel's interest was never released. Mara felt the room narrow. Nora looked at her. That appears to be what he wrote. Mara took the page carefully. Her mother's name was there in Thomas's handwriting. Not in an obituary, not in a database, in a document he had deliberately hidden. What interest, I don't know yet. Nora pointed to a reference number at the bottom. But this letter suggests Thomas believed Rachel retained some legal interest connected to the property. Mara's first reaction was anger. Her second was worse, hope. If Rachel had some connection to the homestead, then perhaps her mother had known about this place after all. Can you find out? I can try. Nora searched the filing number. Nothing appeared in the modern index. She tried Rachel's full name, changed the date range, then stood and disappeared into the records room. Mara waited with Eli in silence. When Nora returned, she carried an old index ledger. There's a reference here that wasn't digitized. She placed it on the desk. It's years later than Thomas's letter. Her finger moved down the page and stopped. Mara leaned forward. The entry listed the homestead parcel, an application concerning ownership, and the person who had filed it. Rachel Ellison. Mara stared at her mother's name. What was she trying to do? I need the underlying file before I can tell you exactly. Nora looked at the index again. But this wasn't Thomas filing on Rachel's behalf. How do you know? Because Rachel filed it herself. Mara could barely form the next question. For this homestead, Nora nodded. It appears your mother tried to restore an ownership claim here. Mara barely slept that night. Rachel Ellison had filed an ownership claim on the homestead years after Thomas wrote that her interest had never been released. That fact followed Mara through the cabin as she rationed water, fed Scout, and checked the temporary rain barrel that still held almost nothing. By sunrise, the question had hardened into anger. Her mother had known. Rachel had known about the land, known about the Ellison name, perhaps even known about the spring, and yet Mara had grown up believing there was no family home anywhere. When Nora called mid-morning and said she had located part of Rachel's old file, Mara was already reaching for her keys. Eli was at the hardware store when she stopped for fuel nearby, and one look at Mara's face made him ask, "She found something." My mother tried to claim the property. That sounds important. It sounds like she knew about it and never told me. Eli hesitated. You were little when she died. I was still her daughter. I didn't say you weren't. Mara immediately regretted snapping at him. Sorry. You don't have to apologize for being angry. That's generous. I'm not saying you're right. Just angry. She almost smiled, but the feeling disappeared when she thought about Rachel's name in the ledger. Nora had spread several photocopies across her desk when Mara arrived. The original application file is incomplete, she said, but I found correspondence attached to the reference. Mara sat. Did she own the place? Not exactly. She was trying to establish that an inherited interest had never been properly removed from the chain of title. So Thomas was right. Possibly. We still have to verify the legal history. Mara looked at a form bearing Rachel's signature. She had seen her mother's handwriting on birthday cards stored in a small box, but never on something like this. Why didn't she finish? Nora slid another letter across the desk. It was from a legal aid office. The language was formal but clear enough. Additional survey work, document retrieval, and representation would require costs Rachel could not cover. Another letter showed she had requested more time. A third asked whether the homestead could be restored or sold if her claim was established. Mara read that sentence twice. She wanted to sell it. Nora looked at her carefully. Keep reading. The next page was a handwritten copy of a letter Rachel had sent to the legal aid office. Parts were faded, but several lines remained legible. She wrote that securing the property could give her and her young daughter stable housing. Or if the house was no longer livable,
provide enough value to start somewhere permanent.
Mara stopped at the words, "my daughter." "That's me," Nora nodded. Mara's throat tightened. But anger rushed in before grief could. Then why didn't she do it? Why did I still end up in foster care? The later correspondence shows her health was deteriorating. Nora placed 2 more pages beside the first. She requested delays. Then the filings stop. Mara stared at the dates. They were from the last period she remembered living with Rachel. A time mostly preserved in fragments, medicine bottles, closed curtains, a neighbor bringing soup, her mother sleeping during the day. She was sick, yes. And she still filed all this? It appears so. Mara pushed the papers away. The story she had built in her head since yesterday that Rachel had simply known about a place to go and chosen not to use it began to collapse. In its place was something harder to hold her mother had tried and failed. That distinction hurt more than Mara expected. She left the county building with copies in an envelope and drove without deciding where she was going until she found herself parked outside the hardware store. Eli was stacking bags near the loading area. He saw her truck and came over. Mara remained behind the wheel. "She tried to get it back," she said when he reached the window. "For us." Eli waited. Mara gripped the steering wheel. She didn't have enough money. Then she got sicker. The paperwork just stopped. "I'm sorry." Mara shook her head. "I spent years thinking nobody tried to keep me. Foster homes ended. People changed their minds. Even the vicars told me I had time. Then I turned 18 and suddenly I didn't." Her voice cracked. "And she hated that it did. And now I find out my mother was filing forms and writing letters about a broken homestead in Wyoming because she was trying to give me somewhere permanent." Eli rested one hand against the truck door. He did not tell her to calm down or search for a positive way to see it. He only said, "Looks like she did." Mara looked away before tears could fall. That simple sentence stayed with her during the drive home. Looks like she did. Rachel had not succeeded. She had not left Mara a clean deed or a working house. But failure was not the same as abandonment. Late that afternoon, Mara checked the remaining water. 2 full gallons, 1 partial. The rain barrel was nearly dry. The North Spring mattered more every day. She was carrying the empty jugs toward the truck when Wade Harlan's pickup appeared on the road. He stopped near the fence and climbed out, holding a narrow, battered ledger. "Found something," he said. Mara set down the jugs. "About the spring? Maybe." He crossed to the fence but did not step over it. "This belonged to my father. Ranch accounts. I remembered he kept old payment records." Mara took the ledger when Wade offered it. The pages smelled of dust and oil. "Why give this to me?" "Because if Thomas paid for something, you should know what—" Mara glanced at him. "You said your family already had access to the spring." "We did. And mine. That's what we're trying to establish." His answer was more patient than she expected. They turned pages together. Feed purchases, equipment repairs, fencing costs. Names Mara did not recognize. Then Wade stopped. There, a handwritten entry listed Thomas Ellison beside a payment amount. The date was decades old. Mara traced the line. Next to Thomas's name was a short notation. "Spring rights," she read. Wade nodded. "Keep going." 2 additional words followed in his father's handwriting. "Permanent, never close." Mara looked from the ledger toward the dry faucet visible through the cabin window. "Your father wrote this?" "Yes." "Then he believed Thomas had permanent rights to the spring?" Wade's face was serious. "That's what it says." Mara held the ledger tighter. Thomas's buried easement had shown the right once existed. Rachel's filings showed her mother had tried to preserve the family's claim. Now a record from the Harlan side told the same story. Wade pointed at the entry. "Whatever happened after your family left, my father clearly thought that water line was never supposed to be shut off permanently." Mara looked uphill toward the unseen spring, then back at the words written decades before she was born. Spring rights permanent. Never close. By the next morning. Mara had placed every piece of evidence she could find across the cabin table. Thomas's buried easement, the survey, the hand-drawn water map, Rachel's old filing copies, and the page number from Wade Harlan's ledger. For the first time, the documents no longer felt like separate fragments. They were beginning to tell the same story. Thomas had believed the water rights were permanent. Rachel had later tried to preserve the family's interest in the homestead. Wade's father had recorded the spring agreement from the Harlan side. Mara did not know whether any of that would be enough legally, but she knew one thing with certainty. The dry cabin had not always been meant to stay dry. She called Nora first. "Bring everything," Nora said. "And if Wade is willing, I want to see that ledger myself." Wade arrived at the county building an hour later, carrying the ledger in a plastic document sleeve. He looked uncomfortable being there, but he handed it to Nora without argument. Eli came too, mostly because Mara had asked if he could help make sense of the old water line after the records were reviewed. Nora spent nearly 2 hours comparing names, parcel numbers, survey descriptions, filing dates, and signatures. She moved slowly and repeated several times that old documents had to be checked against official records before anyone assumed they still carried legal force. Mara forced herself not to interrupt. Eventually, Nora placed the buried easement beside the Harlan ledger. "These were created separately," she said. "That matters." Mara leaned forward. "Because they support each other, potentially. The easement describes access to North Spring. The Harlan ledger records payment connected to permanent spring rights. Rachel's later filing indicates her side of the family believed an interest connected to the property still existed. Wade folded his arms. "So what does that mean for the water right now?" "It means I see enough consistent evidence that nobody should treat Mara as though she invented this claim yesterday." Mara looked at Wade. He nodded once. "Fair," Nora continued, "but full legal review is still required. I'm not issuing a final title decision from this desk." "I know," Mara said. "I just want water." Nora smiled faintly. "That part may be simpler than the title." Wade looked at Mara. "The spring still runs." She stared at him. "You know that." "We use it." "Then the problem is the old line." "Probably," he paused. "If the line crossed onto my property under the old route, I'll allow access for inspection while this gets sorted out." Mara had prepared herself for resistance. The offer caught her off guard. "You're serious? I told you before. My family didn't steal your water. If the line was supposed to stay open, I'd rather know what failed." Eli picked up the survey map. "Then we trace it from the boundary uphill, that afternoon." The four of them met near the fence. Nora did not join the physical search, but she had copied the relevant survey section and marked the recorded easement corridor. Wade led Mara and Eli across Harlan land. Scout stayed close to Mara, unusually focused as they moved through dry grass and uneven ground. The old pipe appeared intermittently beneath shallow soil and stone. In places it was intact. In others, roots and erosion had exposed sections. Eli checked connections while Mara compared distances to the old survey. "If water still reaches this far," he said, "we may only have one bad section." "Or 20, Mara said. "You always this cheerful? Only about plumbing." Wade stopped farther uphill near a shallow depression lined with brush. "Springs beyond there." The air felt cooler as they approached. Mara heard water before she saw it. The sound was small, almost hidden under the wind, but unmistakable. A narrow flow emerged from stone and collected into a protected channel before continuing toward Harlan's working system. Mara stood still. After days of hauling plastic jugs and counting every mouthful, the sight of running water felt almost absurd. "That's North Spring?" she asked. Wade nodded. "Always called it that." Mara thought of Thomas writing N.S. in the notebook over and over, assuming anyone reading it would understand. He really was talking about this. They traced the old branch line downhill from the spring. About halfway to the property boundary, Eli stopped. Here, a section of earth had sunken around a cluster of rocks. They dug carefully and found the pipe crushed beneath one edge of a heavy stone. Corrosion had weakened it, and part of the line had collapsed inward. "That would do it," Eli said. Mara crouched beside the damaged section. "Can it be fixed?" "This part can, today." Eli looked at the remaining light, then at the pipe. "If Wade has fittings," Wade nodded. "Probably." They worked until the sun dropped lower. Wade brought old repair supplies from a ranch shed. Eli cut away the worst section and fitted a replacement length. Mara held tools, cleared soil, and followed instructions without complaint. When the repair was secure, they reopened the old branch gradually. At first, nothing happened. Mara watched the downstream pipe with her hands clenched together. Then Eli heard a faint vibration. "Something's moving." They walked the line back toward the homestead. At the old valve near Mara's boundary, muddy water sputtered from a loosened outlet. Mara's heart jumped. "That's water. Dirty water." Eli warned, "Don't drink it." "I wasn't planning to." The first flow came brown with sediment, then lighter, then almost clear. They let it run while Eli checked for leaks. Scout tried to approach and Mara pulled him back. Not yet. Minutes later, water reached the line nearest the cabin. It did not magically repair the indoor plumbing, and nobody pretended it was safe to drink before testing. But the sound of water moving through pipe was enough. Mara stood beside the cabin with mud on her hands and tears burning unexpectedly behind her eyes. Wade looked toward the old well. "Your grandfather put more work into this system than I remembered." Mara glanced at him. "You believe he was my grandfather now, after all these papers?" "Hard not to." He held out his hand. Mara took it. "Thank you for letting us across. You had a reason to be there." The words mattered more than he probably knew. That evening, Eli helped route the restored flow temporarily to an exterior outlet where it could be flushed and tested later. Mara filled no drinking container from it, but she turned the valve once just to watch clear water pour into the dirt. "You realize you're wasting it," Eli said. "I've been buying water by the gallon. I'm allowed 10 seconds. He smiled. "Fair." The next morning, Nora called and asked Mara to return to the county office. Her voice sounded different, more cautious than before. Mara brought the documents again and found Nora waiting with a new stack of records. "I've been tracing the title history," she said. "The county sale you entered only addressed the interest currently reflected in the tax system." Mara frowned. "What does that mean?" Nora turned one record toward her. "It means the administrative chain may not have captured everything." She showed Mara a reference connected to Rachel's old claim and another tied to Thomas's disputed transfer. There appears to have been an ownership interest associated with Rachel that was never cleanly extinguished. Mara felt the same strange pressure she had felt when first seeing Ellison on the metal box. "But I bought the property." "Yes. That gave you the county's interest through the sale process." "Then what are you saying?" Nora folded her hands. "I'm saying your purchase and your family claim may overlap." Mara stared at her. "I don't understand. If Rachel's unresolved interest passed to her surviving heir, then you may not simply be the stranger who bought this property at auction." Mara's mouth went dry. "Surviving heir? You—" The word landed heavily. Mara looked at the documents spread between them, Thomas's originals, Rachel's filing. the records that had survived because someone had buried them beside an abandoned well. Nora held her gaze and said, "Mara, you may have paid $200 for land you already had a claim to." The formal review did not look anything like Mara had imagined. There was no courtroom, no judge striking a gavel, and no dramatic moment when someone held up Thomas's buried papers and declared the homestead hers. Instead, there were folders, photocopies, old indexes, survey descriptions, signatures, and long stretches of waiting while people compared one document against another. Nora had warned her from the beginning that finding original papers did not magically settle ownership. Now Mara understood what she meant. The documents from beneath the well mattered because other records supported them. Thomas and Evelyn's names appeared on old deeds. The survey boundaries matched the land Mara had bought. The North Spring easement corresponded with the buried pipe they had physically located. Wade's family ledger independently recorded Thomas's payment for permanent spring rights. Most importantly, Rachel's later filing connected the missing ownership interest to Mara's mother. Mara sat beside Nora at the county office while the chain was reconstructed piece by piece. "This transfer is where the problem becomes visible," Nora explained. Pointing to an old record, Thomas disputed how the interest was recorded. "That matches the letter you found. The one saying Rachel's interest was never released?" "Exactly." Nora moved to the next document. "Then years later, Rachel filed her own application trying to restore that interest. She didn't complete the process, but the filing confirms she believed it still existed." Mara looked at her mother's signature. A few weeks earlier, Rachel had been mostly a collection of fading childhood memories. Now Mara could follow her across paper requests for extensions, questions about housing, efforts to establish a claim she could not afford to finish. "So what happened after she died?" Mara asked. Nora turned another page. "Nothing, apparently. That's part of the problem. No one continued the claim." Mara understood without needing the rest explained. Rachel died. Mara entered foster care. She was a child. Nobody followed the unfinished paperwork. Years passed. Records remained incomplete. Taxes and administrative interests moved through their own processes. And eventually the parcel appeared in the county sale, where an 18-year-old girl with nowhere to sleep raised her hand and offered $200. So the county didn't deliberately take it from my family. "Nothing I've seen suggests that," Nora said. "This looks less like a scheme and more like an unresolved chain that nobody came back to fix." "Until me." Nora gave her a small smile. "Until Scout, technically." Mara laughed before she could stop herself. Scout was waiting outside with Eli, who had volunteered to keep him occupied while Mara sat through the review. The laugh faded quickly, but Mara was grateful for it. She had spent days expecting the past to reveal someone she could blame. Instead, what emerged was messier and more believable. Illness, debt, incomplete paperwork, people leaving, records failing to follow them, and a little girl too young to know she had inherited unanswered questions. The buried documents mattered because Thomas had preserved originals when he believed copies and official records were not enough. Rachel had later tried to use that history to recover what remained of the family interest. Neither had completed the task. Somehow Mara had arrived decades later, carrying the same last name and knowing none of it. Nora placed Thomas's notebook on the table. "There's something else." Mara looked up. "Another document?" "Not exactly." Nora opened near the back. "When we first examined this, we focused on measurements and property notes. After finding the second cache, I went through the remaining pages more carefully." Mara felt a flicker of unease. "What did you find?" Nora turned to the final written page. The handwriting was Thomas's, but unlike the repair entries, it was not a list of measurements. It mentioned Rachel. Thomas wrote that he did not know what would happen to the homestead or whether the family would ever live there again. He had kept the papers because land could be forgotten when records became confused. But family should not be. Mara read slowly. Near the bottom was a single sentence separated from the rest. If one of us comes home, let them stay. Mara stopped. She read it again, then a third time. The words blurred. She pressed her fingers against the page, as though touching the paper could somehow shorten the decades between Thomas writing them and Mara finding them. He wrote this for Rachel. Rachel? Perhaps, Nora said quietly, or whoever came after her. Mara thought of the vicar's kitchen, Diane holding her coffee mug. You need to start figuring things out for yourself. She remembered carrying her bags outside while Paul avoided her eyes. She remembered the security guard knocking against the truck window and telling her she could not sleep there. Every place in Mara's life had belonged to someone else. Every bedroom had come with an invisible expiration date. Even kindness had always felt temporary because experience taught her that eventually circumstances changed. Things changed. People changed their minds. But Thomas Ellison, a man she could not remember meeting, had stood somewhere on the same Wyoming land decades earlier and written instructions for a person who might someday return. Let them stay. Mara covered her mouth, but the first sob escaped anyway. She turned away from Nora, embarrassed by the force of it. Nora did not touch her or tell her to stop. She simply waited. I thought nobody tried, Mara managed. My whole life, I thought nobody wanted me enough to try. She looked down at Rachel's filings beside Thomas's notebook. Her mother had tried to recover the property. Her grandfather had protected the records. Neither had succeeded in giving Mara the home they apparently wanted preserved. But suddenly, success seemed less important than the effort itself. She wiped her face with her sleeve. I wish she'd told me. Maybe she believed she had more time. Nora said. Mara nodded. It hurt, but it no longer felt like abandonment. Later that afternoon, the review reached its conclusion. Nora explained it carefully because she did not want Mara turning complicated property law into a fairy tale. The county sale remained part of Mara's current ownership position. Separately, the record supported that Rachel's unresolved interest had passed through the Ellison family line and had never been properly extinguished. Mara, as Rachel's surviving heir, was the person connected to that interest. The buried originals had not created her claim. They had helped prove the history behind it. The water easement was likewise supported by the survey. Thomas's documents and the Harlan ledger. Mara sat quietly when Nora finished. So it really was my family's homestead? Yes. And Rachel tried to get it back? Yes. Mara looked through the window toward the parking lot, where Scout was sitting beside Eli. And I bought it without knowing any of this, Nora smiled. For $200. Mara laughed softly. Then Nora's expression became serious. There is one thing you need to decide. Mara turned back. What resolving the title gives you choices. This property has value, especially with access and water clarified. You don't have to keep living in a damaged cabin simply because your family once did. Mara looked at Thomas's sentence again. If one of us comes home, let them stay. You mean I could sell if that's what you choose? Mara had spent her entire life being told when it was time to leave. Now, for the first time, leaving or staying belonged entirely to her. Mara did not sell. The decision was less dramatic than she expected. There was no single morning when she stood on the porch and announced that she had chosen the homestead. Instead, she woke the day after the review, looked at the 2 duffel bags still waiting beside the cabin door, and realized she no longer wanted to keep living as if someone might arrive and tell her to pack them. The homestead was still difficult. A confirmed family claim did not repair rotten boards. Thomas's buried records did not replace the cracked window or make Mara's pickup stop rattling. The North Spring line had been restored, but the water still needed proper testing before Mara trusted it for drinking. And the cabin plumbing required repairs before she could use it normally. She was still 18, still short on money, and still needed a job. For once, those problems felt like things to solve rather than reasons she would be forced to leave. She found part-time work in town and arranged her hours around repairs. Eli helped when he could, though Mara quickly established a rule: if I can do it myself, you show me instead of doing it for me. Elle stood on the porch holding a replacement board. You know that makes this take twice as long. Then you'll develop patience. I was afraid of that. He showed her where to measure and how to keep the board aligned. Mara drove the nails herself. The first bent, the second went in crooked, the third held. By the time she reached the final board, her arms ached, but she refused Eli's offered hammer. I've got it. I can see that. She drove the last nail flush and stepped back. The porch was not beautiful. Several old boards remained weathered gray beside the newer wood, and one railing still needed reinforcement. But it no longer shifted beneath her feet. Scout walked across it, turned in a circle, and lay down as though inspecting her work. Approved, Mara asked. His tail thumped once. Wade Harlan came by several days later with new boundary markers and copies of the spring access information. He and Mara walked the fence together. There was no apology large enough to rewrite the misunderstandings between their families, and none was necessary. Wade showed her where the recorded easement crossed Harlan land and confirmed that access to the old line would remain open according to the verified agreement. If something breaks uphill, call before you start digging, he said. I learned that part. Wade looked toward the cabin. Thomas would probably be glad somebody's stubborn enough to stay out here again. Mara glanced at him. Was he stubborn? Painfully. Good. Wade smiled. That appears hereditary. Nora arrived one afternoon carrying a document case. Inside were organized copies of the deeds, surveys, Rachel's filings, the North Spring easement, and the records used to establish the Ellison family history. The originals Thomas had hidden were now protected properly rather than returned to the ground. Mara ran her fingers across the case. Feels strange not burying them. Your grandfather buried them because he didn't trust them to survive otherwise. Nora said, You have better options. Mara placed the case on a high shelf inside the cabin, safely away from moisture and Scout. Beside it, she put the old photograph of Thomas and Evelyn. She added one of the few photographs she had kept of Rachel. 3 generations occupied the same shelf for the first time in Mara's memory. The water changed the rhythm of the homestead most visibly. After testing confirmed the restored supply could be used, Eli helped repair enough of the old plumbing to bring water into the kitchen. The first time Mara turned the faucet, the pipes shuddered so violently that Scout barked from the doorway. Brownish water coughed into the sink, then gradually cleared. Mara laughed. That's not reassuring. Old pipes. Eli said, Give them a minute. Everything here needs a minute. Most things worth fixing do. Mara gave him a look. That sounded suspiciously wise. Forget I said it. When the flow finally ran clear, Mara held her hand beneath it. Cold water struck her palm. Weeks earlier, she had stood in the same kitchen, counting plastic gallon jugs and calculating how much money she could afford to drink. Now, North Spring water traveled again through a line Thomas and Evelyn had once maintained. She turned the faucet off carefully, almost reverently. You know you can turn it back on, Eli said. I know. Just checking. Her first paycheck was not much. Mara spent part of it on groceries, part on fuel, and saved the rest for repairs. She did not suddenly become prosperous. Some nights, the Wyoming wind still found cracks in the cabin. Her truck still took 2 tries to start on cold mornings. The roof remained a collection of temporary fixes. But each week, something improved. A repaired hinge, a sealed window, a shelf that no longer leaned. Small things, permanent things. One evening, Eli sat on the porch while Mara worked on the railing. Scout slept between them. Beyond the fence, the grass moved under the wind in long waves. "You sure about staying?" Eli asked. Mara kept sanding the board. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because this place is a lot of work. You could sell once everything's settled. Find something easier." Mara stopped and looked across the property. She thought about the vicar's house and all the houses before it. Bedrooms where she had learned not to put too much on the walls. Closets she had never completely filled. Adults who meant well until circumstances changed. "It's the first place I've ever had that couldn't change its mind about me." Eli was quiet. Then he nodded. "That's a pretty good reason." Mara went inside before sunset. Her 2 duffel bags were still beside the door. She had walked past them every day without noticing how strange that was. Even after learning the truth about the homestead, she had never unpacked completely. Some part of her had remained ready. Mara carried the bags into the bedroom and opened them on the floor. She hung her clothes in the narrow closet. She put her few books on a shelf and placed the cardboard box of keepsakes beneath the bed. When both duffels were empty, she folded them. For a moment, she stood holding them, remembering how many times she had filled those bags because somebody else had decided where she would live next. Then she pushed them under the bed. Empty. Scout watched from the doorway. "We're not going anywhere," she told him. Later, Mara took Thomas's notebook from the document case and reread the sentence she now knew by heart. "If one of us comes home, let them stay." She thought of Rachel filling out forms while sick, trying to recover a broken homestead or enough value to give her daughter stability. Rachel had failed to finish the claim. Thomas had failed to preserve the family's life here. But neither failure meant Mara had been forgotten. The land had passed through confusion, debt, missing records, and years of neglect until the county listed it for $200 and an 18-year-old girl with nowhere else to sleep happened to raise her hand. Scout had done the rest by digging beside an old well. Mara closed the notebook. Before bed, she placed a bowl beneath the kitchen faucet and turned the handle. Clear, cold water filled it. Scout came over and drank noisily. Mara smiled and stepped onto the repaired porch. Evening had settled across the Wyoming land, turning the distant hills dark against the remaining light. Behind her, on the shelf, stood the photograph of Rachel beside Thomas and Evelyn. Nearby rested the documents proving what had nearly disappeared from the official story. The homestead belonged to the history of the Ellison family, and Mara had come back to it without even knowing she was coming home. She had no treasure buried beneath the land, no fortune waited inside Thomas's boxes. She had water, a damaged cabin, 40 difficult acres, a job in town, a dog asleep near the kitchen, and people nearby who had chosen to help without asking her to earn the right to stay. For Mara, it was more than enough. She listened to the water settle in Scout's bowl behind her and looked across the property bearing her family name. For the first time in her life, there was no need to wonder how long she was allowed to remain. No packed bag waited by the door. No adult controlled the answer. Mara stood on her own porch under the Wyoming sky and realized she would never again have to ask, "How long can I stay?"